So how reasonable are you? Well, you probably think you're very reasonable and would argue that case in most scenarios where you have to defend yourself in any way. Mark with you out here at the gun range talking about the fifth in the five considerations, the five important considerations to become hard to convict should you be involved in a self-defense shooting. Having to defend yourself is bad enough, but then being prosecuted for it can be a nightmare beyond all nightmares. All you got to do is read from a few people that have had that happen and see their whole life taken apart because they simply defended themselves with a firearm. Reasonableness may be the most loaded consideration of all these others. I've got it fifth, but it actually engulfs all the rest of the considerations, from innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance. This engulfs all of those. Reasonableness. Was your act of self-defense and the proportionality of it, using your gun in self-defense, was it reasonable? Well, if you pulled your gun and shot somebody because you were afraid for your life, of course you would think it was reasonable. But after the shooting, what you've got to be concerned about is who else is going to think is reasonable. Did these people that were standing around, the eyewitnesses, think it was reasonable? So, hey, police officer, Mr. Police Officer, we got eyewitnesses here. You don't necessarily need to point that out unless you're absolutely sure they know what they saw, because typically eyewitnesses at a crime scene or at a self-defense shooting, whatever it may be, all think they saw something, and they may ask 3 or 4 different people that were eyewitnesses to something what they saw and find out they all saw something different. That's not a real dependable way to defend yourself. The reasonableness of what you did is going to be determined. First of all, the police will show up. Was it reasonable? Should you have pulled your gun and shot somebody in self-defense? If it goes through the police and you are arrested at the scene because they're concerned about, they're not sure that you were reasonable in that, it goes to a prosecutor. And if a prosecutor looks at it, but remember, prosecutors are looking for somebody to prosecute. They're not looking for innocent people. They're looking for something to prosecute in what you did. They're not concerned about you. They're not concerned about your innocence. They're concerned about whether you're guilty of something or not. And if it's not considered, if there's anything about your self-defense shooting that appears to not be reasonable, they will pick it up and they will pick it out and they will dig through it and take every opportunity that they can. They'll do everything they can to pile on everything they can pile on to question the reasonableness of your self-defense shooting. And they'll put that in front of a jury, in front of 12 people that don't know you, and question the reasonableness of you shooting and harming or possibly killing somebody. Reasonableness. The most loaded issue of all the 5 issues that we're talking about, this is the most loaded one. Because you, when you draw your gun and shoot, are doing it under your reasoning that somebody is about to harm or kill you or your family or somebody else around you, and you pull your gun and shoot. It may not look that way to a lot of other people around you, including the police, prosecutor, and a jury. Let's look at the scenario here of whether something is reasonable or not and what it might mean in front of a prosecutor, in front of a jury. So we've got a scenario here where somebody right here, these 2 guys are at me. They're shouting threats at me. They're angry at me about something. They're shouting threats. They're shouting what they're going to do to me. They're telling me what they're going to do to me. This one has something in his hand. He has a blunt object. He has a knife. He has something that he's threatening me with right here in front of me, right where I can't get away. I don't have an avenue of immediate escape. This guy's with him. This guy raises whatever that weapon is, a knife or a club or whatever he's got. He raises the weapon. I draw my firearm and defend myself. Now, this guy over here this guy is unarmed. But I'm in the heat of the moment. The adrenaline is up. I've just fired my gun at the guy that's threatening me. And the one that's right here with him is also moving. He doesn't have a weapon in his hand, but I instinctively fire at him too. And I just put a round through both of their chest cavity, with one of them being armed and the other one not being armed. In my mind at that moment, with the adrenaline flowing through me, it was reasonable. Would it be reasonable to the police that I shot the one that was armed, but that I also shot the one over here that was not armed? Reasonableness. What would it mean? What does it mean to you? What do you think about that scenario right there? But really, if you're putting yourself in that position of the person that is defending themselves, what you have to understand is it really won't make any difference what you think about it after you pull the trigger. You've got to understand and have to determine in an immediate moment, with that kind of adrenaline, that you had to shoot to defend yourself from this one, but did you have to defend yourself from that one? Could you have backed up? Could you have holstered your weapon? Could you have defended yourself some other way other than pulling the trigger? And from where I put the shot there, it could have very well been right through his heart, killing someone that was unarmed, even though he was shouting threats and was with somebody who clearly could have done me damage. Would it be reasonable that I shot this one along with this one? This would no doubt end up with me being arrested, possibly prosecuted, possibly convicted, or maybe not. In some states, it has a whole lot to do with the mental state that the person defending themselves in is, whether they actually believe that this was an imminent threat. But in many cases, if reasonableness cannot be proven, was it reasonable for me to shoot a person who was unarmed, even though he was with somebody who was armed? Don't know. Being able to sort these things out before you ever get to that scenario is what's critical about this series right here. Getting to the range, practicing with your guns, working these scenarios out in your mind is so important. Hopefully you can see from this series, if you've watched it, you can see from this series how incredibly important it is to be ready mentally to pull your gun. So that if you do have to pull your gun in a self-defense scenario and you fire, that you can hold it right here if you need to, back away and say, back away from me. You're not armed. Don't come closer. Giving them a warning rather than pulling the trigger on them. We don't know what will happen in any self-defense scenario. We don't know what's going to be reasonable to anybody else. But it's so important to get out and keeping these considerations in mind, getting out on a gun range, wherever you shoot, and practicing and running through these scenarios in your mind, so that if it ever does come up, or the unthinkable comes up and you have to defend yourself with your gun, you'll be able to know. You won't have to go, well, is it this, is it that, is it this, is it that? You'll have that worked out before you get there, so that you can pull, do what you have to do, settle your nerves, use your voice, back away, do what you have to do to keep from, after you defending yourself, ending up prosecuted and possibly in prison, having your whole life taken apart. Reasonableness, the one that swallows everything else. 5 considerations: innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and finally, when it all comes down to it, is it reasonable? That's so loaded that I can't even give it any further description. Because if a prosecutor is looking at a jury, and the jury is looking at you, and that prosecutor can convince a jury, no matter what happened, it was not reasonable, and as far as they're concerned, you're guilty. Get it worked out before you ever get there. Work out on the gun range, run these things through your mind, set up scenarios with simple targets, and be ready should you ever have to defend yourself with a firearm. Be ready to be hard to convict, and even better, be hard to prosecute in the first place. I'm Mark, and I'll see you again soon in another Christian Gun Owner video.